Now we're going to switch over to our next keynote speaker. And so I'll introduce him. Dr. Cliff Dahm is a professor emeritus at the University of New Mexico here in Albuquerque. He retired from UNM in 2015 and then spent 2 years as a lead scientist for the Delta Science Program, which is part of the Delta Stewardship Council in Sacramento, California. His distinguished career in ecosystem studies and aquatic ecology has involved, among other things, stream geomicrobiology, stream biogeochemistry, dynamics of riparian zones, surface groundwater interactions, climate dynamics, and the ecology of intermittent rivers. Dr. Dahm has contributed significantly to the incorporation of science in the management of the Bay Delta ecosystem, balancing ecosystem recovery with water supply reliability. He's here today to share lessons learned regarding science planning and prioritization. So it's my great pleasure to give a Zoom welcome to Dr. Cliff Dahm. Go ahead.
So first of all, Catherine, I wanted to thank you for the invitation to speak today. I was a little bit befuddled when I initially received the invitation because I haven't really worked on the Middle Rio Grande since the 2000 to 2010 window of time. I was sort of thinking about, well, what could I present that might be of interest to the people attending the symposium? And my thinking about that, I initially went back to some of the early work that I did with Manuel Moles, Cliff Crawford, Maury Villette, Lisa Ellis, where we actually used manipulative experimentation to open up bosky floodplains that had not seen water for 4 decades, and seeing how the system responded to that re-wetting. Those were a series of papers that derived from that, and there were some big surprises. When you accumulate as much organic matter as these detached floodplains have over decades, they don't always respond exactly like you might think they would when water is added. We had anoxia and amazing amounts of metabolism, but we also found that some estivating organisms emerged, and we got some recovery early on in the aquatic system, and then it took a few years for decomposition to move far enough for more of the vegetation to respond. Second project that I got involved in the Rio Grande was basically a study that lasted a decade, started in the late 90s, went through about 2009, where we addressed the question of how much water does the riparian plant community in the bosque use, and does native versus non-native communities have differential water use? We found that it really doesn't matter which species makes up the bosque, but it does matter how dense the vegetation is. And so a series of papers that address this issue of water use in the bosque. Those were a couple things that I thought I could talk about, but thinking a little bit more about it and talking with Catherine, I decided that what might actually be useful as you're doing some interesting planning and maybe changes a bit to the overall collaborative program was to talk a little bit about some personal experience that I had leading the Delta Science Program in California. And I actually did this twice. I was a glutton for punishment. I did it for 4 years from 2008 to 2012, and then 2 more years from 2015 to 2017. So I'm going to focus on that, and I hope that the information I provide you is of interest, and I am also going to try to link it to some of the things that I know are ongoing currently with planning and science programs that are associated with the Middle Rio Grande. So here's the outline for this talk. You're going to get the Cliff Notes version on the California Delta and the Delta's role in California water resources and biodiversity. For those of you who don't know that much about the Delta, hopefully this will give you be a quick primer. I then wanted to talk a little bit about management plans, science and monitoring programs, independent science boards or advisory groups, and the role of lead scientists. Some of these things are actively already involved or engaged and going on within the collaborative program. Others are things that I'll draw from my experiences in California. They wanted to focus specifically on adaptive management, both in the California Delta and the Middle Rio Grande. In preparing for this talk, it was interesting for me to find out that the executive committee of the collaborative program has embraced the use of adaptive management in the scientific endeavor in the Bosque and in the Middle Rio Grande, and that kind of use of adaptive management appears to be being developed and being applied now in the Middle Rio Grande. California Delta's been doing this for about a decade longer, and maybe might be of interest for you to hear a little bit about what the adaptive management programs in the Delta currently look like. And then finally, I was going to talk a little bit about something that occurred during my second tenure in California, and that was the development of a science action agenda. It has proved to be very effective in both getting people working together and getting resources to do the science. And I'll lay that out as something that might be worth considering for the Middle Rio Grande Bosque, or the Middle Rio Grande River and Bosque. So my Cliff Note background on the Delta, we'll move through it fairly quickly, but for those of you who are not acquainted with the California Delta, it's an area about the size of Rhode Island, 720,000 acres. It's a freshwater delta, and it is also one of the major water supply sources for the state of California. It's found at the confluence of two major rivers, the Sacramento River and the San Joaquin River. It's an area that now the land use is predominantly agriculture, but there is also a lot of waterways and water features, and there's a lot of tourism that uses these water features, in addition to the moving of a considerable amount of water out of the Delta to Southern California and into the agricultural areas of the Central Valley. Here's a fairly simplistic, but I think useful overview of where the water comes from and where the water goes in the California Delta. The Sacramento River is the bigger of the two tributaries by far. About 80% of the inflow comes through the Sacramento River. And in general, the quality of that water is quite good. About 15% of the water that arrives in the Delta comes from the San Joaquin River. It is poorer quality, higher salts, some water quality problems with metals, and high nutrients. The third source, about 5% of the inflow, comes from east side rivers. These are rivers that start up in the Sierra Nevada, and these two also have pretty high quality water that it reaches the Delta. The Delta then is fresh water, and eventually then interacts with the brackish water that's coming in from San Francisco Bay. And where that interaction between freshwater and saltwater begins is dependent on climatological variability. Low flow years, it can move into the Western Delta, but most of the time it is out towards the ocean. The water that arrives in the Delta is then put to a variety of uses. In Delta uses, again, are predominantly agriculture. And it varies how much of that water is being used, very much depending on the hydrologic conditions of the water year. In wet years, fairly small amount of water is used in the Delta, but in drier years it can be up to, I guess now there's been years where it's been up to 15% of the use. The water that actually then it goes into San Francisco Bay, again, is highly linked to the hydrology of the system. Wet years, 5/6 of the water ends up going into the bay. Dry years, you can have more than half of the, you can only have about half of the water being, making it to the bay. And that difference is then made up by export water. This is water that's pumped out of the system, which again The amount varies from year to year, and the percentage is very much a function of the of the hydrology. The export that does occurs at the southern end of the delta, and those two pumping facilities, a state pumping facility and a federal pumping facility, have the capacity of removing a maximum of about 11,000 CFS. To give you a Middle Rio Grande benchmark, that would be about 11 times the average flow of the Rio Grande in Albuquerque can be pumped out by these pumps. And so therefore, to get the water down to these pumps at the south end of the delta, there is a redirection of the water, particularly the water from the Sacramento River, down into the pumping area. And so there is a substantial amount of hydraulic modification that goes on, particularly when the pumps are working at medium to full capacity. There's also some San Joaquin water that gets pulled in, and during certain times of the year, you can actually reverse flows in the delta. And so that is actually, from a management perspective, something that is not desirable. So this is kind of the situation that occurs often when water flows are being directed to the pumps to pump out water to the Southern California and to the to the agricultural areas. The delta, much like the Middle Rio Grande, has been a system that has been actively changing, particularly actively changing during the past century. The drivers of change that impact the delta, the first four here are probably very much the same ones that you would list if you were thinking about the Middle Rio Grande. Climate change is having a clear and distinct impact. Endangered species are very important in the planning and management of the system. There are approximately 60 threatened or endangered species that utilize the delta. Invasive species are a key problem in the delta. The delta and the bay are sometimes referred to as some of the most invaded systems that we have on Earth. And certainly there's a lot of invasive species issues. And human population growth and human demand for water are also increasing in this part of the world. Three other drivers of change that are very active in the delta that are not problematic here, and as far as I know, in the Middle Rio Grande, is land subsidence. The delta is made up of peat, and that peat, when it's put into agriculture, loses elevation. And so much of the delta now is over 5 meters or 15 feet below sea level. There's also sea level rise. As sea level rise continues, it basically impacts the delta by how much water must be utilized to keep the salt at bay. And that is estimated that for every foot of sea level rise, it takes about 500,000 acre feet of water to keep the salinity from impinging into the western delta. Those kinds of changes could very much are very likely to impinge on the amount of water that's available for human use. And then finally, earthquakes. This is an area that's very seismically active, and earthquakes are always a concern with much of the delta below sea level. A large earthquake could have potential catastrophic damage. So some of the major causes of stress to the system are things that also I know are things that are big issues here in the Middle Rio Grande. We just had a session on ecohydraulics and ecohydrology, and certainly those are major issues in the California Delta. Changes in the food web are critical changes that have to be addressed from a management perspective. There are water quality problems, both in terms of nutrients and in terms of toxicants making it into the delta. And then there's climate and habitat changes, and wetland reduction, channelized rivers, floodplain loss, and snowpack loss are all factors that could easily be interchanged between the California Delta and the Middle Rio Grande. So when I was in California the first time, from 2008 to 2012, it was a time that was pretty tumultuous just from the severe recession that was having an effect throughout the United States and worldwide. It was interesting that at this point in time, a number of factors came together to make water rise to the top of the things that needed to be done statewide. And Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger felt that the best way to address this was to work with the Senate and the Assembly to actually plan for a special legislative session focused entirely on water. It was interesting to be there when this was happening. The session was called in November of 2009, and over a period of about a week, the special session passed 5 major bills that dealt with water and water resources in California. The one that I want to quickly highlight for you is the first one. It was a creation of a new state agency, the Delta Stewardship Council, within which was embedded a science program, the Delta Science Program. And this program then immediately began the task of coming up with a planning document called the Delta Plan, very much, I think, in ways similar to what the collaborative program is doing with their long-term plan. The creation of the Stewardship Council in 2009 basically set the wheels in motion for coming up with this council. It's comprised of 7 appointed members, 4 by the governor, 1 by the Senate, 1 by the Assembly, and 1 the current managing body for the Delta. And it's supported by science experts. And the science experts were 2 groups, a science program, and the other as an independent science board. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute. But the first things that then occurred were the development of a Delta Plan. And the interesting aspect then of the Delta Plan, which is different, I think, than the collaborative program, was that the Delta Plan was a legally enforceable document with policies that had the force of law, plus a series of recommendations that recommended things that could be done to improve the overall quality of the Delta, with 2 goals in mind. One goal was a more reliable water supply for the state of California, and the second one was a healthy and improved condition within the Delta. And the initial Delta Plan was approved in May of 2013 and became legally enforceable when California Department of Justice okayed the enforceable policies and began to be then the management the management program for the Delta. And a large part of that is coordinating all the various agencies that do work in the Delta, very much like the collaborative program on the Middle Rio Grande involves the 19 signatories that work together collaboratively on the Middle Rio Grande. This Delta Plan brought together 17 agencies collaboratively to work on issues of the California Delta. In addition, the Delta Plan the Delta Plan and the enabling legislation called for a Delta Science Plan. And that Delta Science Plan was approved in the end of 2013. And it's aspects of both the Delta Plan and the Delta Science Plan that I wanted to highlight for you. The first thing I wanted to highlight is the requirement in the Delta Plan by statute that adaptive management be used in the management of managing of the system. So the enabling legislation included the following wording, that the Delta Plan should include a science-based, transparent, and formal adaptive management strategy for ongoing ecosystem restoration and water management decisions. So that was a requirement of the Delta Stewardship Council enabling legislation. And in that legislation, a formal definition of adaptive management was provided. And that adaptive management definition is here. I wanted to highlight a few words here that I think are important. Flexible decision-making, knowledge acquisition, monitoring, evaluation, and then continuous improvements in management planning and implementation. This is something now that has as of 2010, been the state statute, the state law, and they've been working on this now for about a decade. When I was reviewing the current status of some of the science plans for the Middle Rio Grande, I enjoyed the opportunity to read through the Science and Adaptive Management Plan draft that has been issued in October of 2020. I think it's a framework that's coming along nicely, and it certainly is going to link with the Middle Rio Grande long-term plan for implementing collaborative program science and adaptive management process. I did find, however, that it was very interesting that the adaptive management, at least as it's stated in the glossary, this is the Middle Rio Grande adaptive management. I found that the level of detail for adaptive management and the explanation of adaptive management for here in the Middle Rio Grande, that this is quite a rigorous and detailed description of adaptive management. A more general adaptive management definition that I'm more used to is the one above, where you have these key concepts of basically planning, implementing, and then evaluating, and using that sequence of events to make decisions on how you're going to manage your system. The adaptive management program, when it was initially being developed back in 2010, 11, and 12, was something that many of the decision makers and policy makers in California didn't have a lot of experience with. And so many of the questions that I often would be asked to address is, can you give us an example of adaptive management? Can you provide examples of where adaptive management has been done effectively? So one of the things that I'll just throw out as a thought process is that as adaptive management is applied increasingly in the Middle Rio Grande, look outside your system to other systems where adaptive management has had some successes. And I'll give you, three examples that I often used when I was in California. Southeast Queensland in Australia has a very interesting healthy waterways program that uses adaptive management, I think, very effectively. Efforts in the South Florida, where certain areas of South Florida, like the Kissimmee River, has then now fairly substantively restored using an adaptive management framework as they iteratively did the various restoration projects is another second example. The third example are a large number of salt ponds in San Francisco Bay. And these salt ponds have been restored, a few at a time, with various adaptive management structures put in place so that they could assess how well the restoration projects were doing, and also what surprises they were finding, and then using that information as they added more and more of these salt ponds to the restoration project. And then finally, this is just a thought process and may or may not be appropriate for the Middle Rio Grande, but one thing that was a success in my mind for the Delta Science program and for the Delta Science Plan was the development of a science action agenda. It was called out in the Delta Science Plan that this should be done. This meant getting the scientists working in the system and the agencies working in the system to sit down and develop an action agenda for science. This was done in 2016-17 over a 16-month period. It was linked to some synthesis efforts that are called the State of Bay Delta Science Synthesis, published in peer-reviewed journals or as a book. And the process basically got ideas from scientists and from managers and from decision makers. A list of management needs and associated science actions were developed. As you might guess, when you sit down with large numbers of managers, decision makers, and scientists, you're going to get a large list of different management needs and associated actions that they would be interested in having researched or carried out. This process really required openness and clarity. The people that initiated it and carried it out, I think, were particularly good in being open and clear about getting information from as wide a group of audience as possible. The information, as you might guess, ends up with hundreds and hundreds of suggestions. I believe the initial list that was compiled from the scientists, decision makers, and policy folks was somewhere around 600 science actions that could be considered. This was refined within the Delta Science program and put out for public comment. It also was reviewed by the Independent Science Board that was established by the initial enabling legislation. It's a group of 10 outstanding world-class scientists that are a standing board that basically helps with science issues in the Delta. And then after those reviews and public comment, the document was further reviewed and ultimately taken to the Delta Stewardship Council for their review and eventual acceptance. This process of putting together a science action agenda proved to be very helpful in getting resources to basically allow for much of the kind of science direction that this collaborative effort had pulled together. There ultimately the final version, which was published in 2017, had 5 action areas and 13 priority science actions. This is the initial science action agenda for that period of time. They are actively working on the next one, the 2022 to 2026 science action agenda. The challenge here is coming up with something that is not too prescriptive, but also does allow a clear suite of directions that can be utilized when seeking funding or for putting together proposal requests. One of the things that were particularly effective with this science action agenda was that there is water bond money in California, and it allowed some of the funding from the water bonds to go into these specific areas of research. These 5 that happen to be listed on this slide are for the Delta system, but I suspect if you read through them, you'll sort of say, well, yeah, some of these may actually fit pretty well here in the Middle Rio Grande. The first one is basically calling for more involvement between natural resource managers and social scientists. The second one is doing a better job on synthesizing the data that we have. The third one is to develop tools that really evaluate the effectiveness of various habitat restoration projects. The fourth one is looking at interactions between stressors and species of concern, particularly in endangered and threatened species, and their interactions with other species within the system. And then finally, how do you modernize the monitoring, data management, and modeling? I was struck by some of the new methodology that was being presented in the eco-hydraulics talks just before my talk. These kinds of things are happening also in terms of water quality. They're also happening in terms of dealing with these large databases that can be generated by some of these new methods. So finally, I want to just basically wind up with a little personal story. And I was doing this job as the lead scientist for the Delta Science Program and being a part of the Delta Stewardship Council between 2008 and 2012, and then later on again in 2015 to 2017. In 2010, there was a paper published in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment by Gene Likens. I don't know how many of you know Gene Likens or know who Gene Likens is, but Gene Likens has been a personal mentor, friend, and colleague for many decades. And Gene Likens is a person who took on some of the most challenging environmental issues in the United States. He has won a Medal of Science for his efforts. He is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He took on 2 major programs when I was kind of getting started in my career. The first one was addressing the issue of forest management and clear cutting. And he was directing at that point in time the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New England. And they did some whole ecosystem manipulative experiments to see what happened when you do clear cutting relative to water quality. And one of the things that they found when a forest is removed, in the years immediately after removal, there was a big flush of nutrients that moved into the system, moved into the waterways there. It turned out that this sort of pioneering research was duplicated all around the country, and many systems did not respond in the same way that Hubbard Brook did. And a much better understanding of the interaction between forests and waterways was developed. And ultimately, 30 years later, a new forest plan was adopted by the U.S. Forest Service that basically used a lot of this research to recommend different ways of harvesting forest products because of the science that was done there. That was the first big program that Gene worked on. The second one that he worked on that I think many of you are very well acquainted with was he and his group at Hubbard Brook was the group that really identified the problem of acid rain in the United States. And he worked on that for many decades. It was a difficult and I think, like Laura Pasca said yesterday, repetitive good science communication, speaking to decision makers, speaking to people who could make a difference. Ultimately, made some landmark decisions that have had some positive effects on the overall acid rain problem here in the United States. Gene, in his paper that he wrote, the title of the paper was "The Role of Science in Decision Making. Does Evidence-Based Science Drive Environmental Policy?" The role of science in decision making is something that I think all of us who work at this interface between science and management are thinking about. And I enjoyed very much listening to Laura talk about her experiences as a journalist trying to communicate the science that many of us do. Gene Likens had 3 take-home messages in his 2010 paper. And I thought I'd share them with you because I think they're appropriate for the California Delta. I think they're appropriate for the Middle Rio Grande. The first one is that considerable time elapses between detecting environmental problems and taking political action. In many ways, the thornier the problem, the longer it often takes. And he, in his paper, talks about both the acid rain issue and the forest clear-cutting issue. Yeah, the second point that he makes is dealing with environmental change requires that we be better communicators, and that scientists need to communicate with managers, policymakers, the media, and the public. Same kind of message that you got loud and clear yesterday from Laura. And it's certainly the challenge of being a lead scientist in a state agency where you have a science program embedded with the decision makers. This is a take-home message that rang loud and clear to me, is that this communication component was very much one of the biggest and most important things that I had to do. And then finally, one that I thought was interesting, but if you think about it, I think it's very appropriate. He also pointed out that scientists need to demonstrate ethical behavior and have unassailable data, perseverance, and good communication skills. And I think that in many ways encapsulates the way that he did science and his group has done science. Ethics was always front and center, and they always were very much wanting to be sure that the data that they were gathering, collecting, analyzing, synthesizing, and communicating was the very best possible data and the best kind of information they could provide. So with that, if any of you are interested in delving deeper into some of the issues in California, here are some websites. Basically, the Delta Stewardship Council website is a good starting place. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions if there's any time left. And if I can get back